someone who was nothing but a disposable tool to be used by a terrorist, the world was an absolutely hostile thing to Rail, something to feel nothing for but contempt. Rail's role in the organization they belonged to, Lamia, was that of a bomb expert, or more accurately, a mad bomber. At their inception as beings created by alchemy, Rail and their fellow unaging homunculi were subjected to experiments, heartless dissections, sometimes without anesthesia, performed on them by Huey Laforet's researchers, who treated their subjects like mere things, and not as living beings in their own right. Eventually, that's how Rail saw theirself too, as a thing. At one point, whether voluntarily or not, Rail lost the ability to feel pain after being cut into a countless amount of times over the course of their young life. After enough experiments, the homunculi as a whole lost the ability to see themselves as anything close to resembling humanity, or perhaps they willingly did so in order to cope with the agony of their terrible existence. After all, a normal human wouldn't be able to tolerate such torment. Because of this, the homunculi could confide in each other, and the bonds between a few of them were quite strong. Rail was close to two homunculi in particular, Christopher and Frank. Rail was usually paired with Frank, whether on a mission or not. The two had a sibling-like relationship. Rail acted as the wisecracking, teasing elder to their younger, sensitive, and more timid brother. But Rail had genuine care for Frank, feeling sympathy for him when scrutinized for his appearance, or willing to lay down his life for him in combat. Frank followed closely behind Rail, doing everything he said out of respect and love for his brother. The two were unavoidable targets for attention when they found themselves in public. A large, beer barrel-shaped boy and a child who looked like a stitched-up doll, with their geometric suture scars covering their body. People couldn't help but notice the pair, but always avoided interacting with them. Rail didn't care to make friends with humans. They didn't belong amongst them anyway. Although standing out was a clear risk to completing their missions, Rail was the most vocal about their hatred for Huey Laforet, and didn't take their jobs all too seriously in the first place. They didn't particularly mind the attention, though. Rail fantasized about being a famous bomber, causing mayhem all across the country. Perhaps it was a way of feeling some form of belonging in the world. Rail's relationship to Christopher felt like an inverse to their interactions with Frank. With Chris, Rail was the one who was the butt of the jokes, and felt like they needed to play catch-up with the more experienced older sibling, and not just when it came to their banter, but their spirits as well. To Rail, Christopher was the greatest thing in the world. If Frank was the younger brother whom Rail felt pride in being an example to, Christopher was Rail's own figure of admiration. His confidence, his combat prowess, his disturbing accuracy in calling you out on your feelings that you tried not to show to the world. Rail admired Chris, as irritating as he could be. Once, Christopher had made friends with a human, and the mere thought of this sent Rail into distress. Christopher is mine, my Lamia partner, my friend, my big brother. The thought of losing a loved one to someone else, especially to a human, haunted Rail's thoughts, and created a 1,000-ton weight in their stomach and a searing pain in their chest. Rail fought this emotion, trying to convince theirself that it didn't actually bother them, but fighting it likely only made it worse. For someone who grew up in a world lacking meaningful connections, Chris stood out as a shining ray of beauty and serenity to Rail. They just wanted to be with Christopher, the one who could give them a place of belonging in this world, one where they could be okay. But perhaps Rail didn't belong with him because Chris himself wasn't okay. Rail didn't care about that. Chris was all they needed. Nothing else in this world mattered to Rail, and they didn't care whether being with Chris meant they were insane. It had to be better than being alone. In 1933, after a crushing defeat to a human more powerful than himself, Christopher disappeared. Had he run away in fear? Was he ashamed that he was defeated by an inferior being? Had he simply been killed? Regardless, Rail's world was already quite small, and it only became smaller and more suffocating when they lost Chris. It wasn't clear whether Chris saw his defeat as a blow to his ego or not, but it certainly was to Rail's. Eventually, Rail would have their own confrontation with dangerous humans that would leave a similar impact that they imagined it left on Chris. This made Rail realize something, that one idea that helped Rail and the others feel a sense of superiority, the thought that they were stronger, a higher race than humans, was nothing but a heat haze. To avoid spoiling too much of the story for you, I'll forego mentioning the details here, but something happened that finally pushed Rail to their breaking point, a point of seemingly no return, a dark pit, deeper and darker than the world Rail had already been living in, the pit of self-destruction. Rail had to find a new state of being to strive for, one that seemed more realistic than the idea of being stronger than humans, going insane. If Rail could go insane, that might be a way out, a way to cope with the pain, the sadness, the loneliness, the absolute horror that was Rail's mindscape. Rail wasn't strong like Frank, and couldn't own their inhumanity like Chris could, so what was Rail? Lost and alone, Rail hoped that, in some way, going insane could bring them closer to Chris. When you live in a world that offers nothing but pain, abuse, and bloodshed, one might obsessively cling to the few things that they see as good to them, such as friends. But what happens when you lose those friends? What happens when all you put your value in, your hope, your light, your everything, is gone? When all you have left in the world is yourself and your demons. You break down. You're at the end of your rope. You only have one goal left on your mind. Blow it up. Everything. Blow up all of your nightmares. Every last one. Or perhaps there is a quicker method to destroy everything. Blowing yourself up. Maybe, deep down, Rail hoped that, after they died, they would leave an impression on the world, to go out in a way where they would be expressing theirself to their fullest. A nameless little thing that was forced to suddenly end their own existence and disappear forever, turning the heads of many and leaving a mark, like an explosive. Something tries to invade Rail's world. It can't be good. There's nothing that can be good. Now that you've lost all that was good to you, all you have left is your wounds and your bombs. Blow it up. But this thing seems familiar. Familiar to that time Rael met a girl who looked to be the same age as them, although perhaps her looks betrayed her age, just like with Rael, who was actually almost 15. This girl had accidentally bumped into Frank and screamed upon the sight of the two strange-looking children, but after receiving a talking to from a serious-looking, monocled man who accompanied her, she apologized and quickly started speaking to the two, as if there was nothing strange about their appearances. She didn't seem to be hiding her fear, holding in another scream, or perhaps a mocking laugh. She warmed up to them, and their interaction was rather familiar before long. Rael teased the girl about being a camera thief, given the camera around her neck which seemed far too large for her person. And the girl was clearly upset at their accusation, but rather playful about it. It reminded Rael of some of the other homunculi, like Sickle and the Poet, who were constantly at odds with each other. It also reminded Rael of their own interactions with Frank and Chris. To Rael, that was just what friends did. Rael would never admit it, but being around the other homunculi was a safe place for them. Inwardly, Rael felt quite relaxed with Lamia. In situations where Rael was hopelessly losing a fight, the appearance of their friends was comforting, even if it was the disembodied voice that belonged to that woman, Lisa, simply because she was familiar and an ally, even if she was someone whom Rael really would have liked to blow away, given that she constantly condemned them for their open hatred for Huey. To make up for such a disrespectful introduction, the girl and the man in Chicago had eventually invited Rael and Frank to eat with them. This was the first time Rael had ever received a proposal such as this before, least of all from a human. The two even accommodated for Frank's inability to sit in a restaurant due to his size, and decided to eat hot dogs in the park. The girl introduced herself as Carol. Rael told the girl a bold-faced lie about their occupation, claiming that they and Frank were from the circus, and that Rael was in charge of staging the explosive stunts. Carol believed every word of it. What wasn't a lie, however, was when Rael went on about their love for explosives. The girl's face lit up at their stories, which made Rael feel a way they perhaps had never felt before, a feeling which Rael would come to dismiss until Rael's mind was hazy, and only one thought echoed in their mind: blow it up. After two men had attempted to kidnap them, Rael set off a bomb, which might have killed those men, but it certainly knocked Rael out cold. They remembered a brief moment of being awake between then and now. A bunch of people were swarming Rael with distressed voices, so they blew them up too. Or had they? Rael woke up again in a familiar, nostalgic setting, an abandoned warehouse, the likes of which Rael and Frank had stayed in over the years. There was a swarm of voices, possibly the ones from before. No matter, Rael had to blow them up now. But what's this? The bombs were gone? Not only were Rael's explosives a means of protecting theirself from others, but it was also their way out of this life. Losing their bombs deeply troubled Rael. They couldn't fight, and they couldn't escape the world. What made them even more uneasy was the one who woke them up. A woman who spoke rather childish for her apparent age, mentioned a doctor, asking if they were okay, and saying that their wounds weren't severe. She wore a guileless smile bereft of malice. Rael had seen a smile similar to this before, from a woman who was an enemy of Huey, and wanted to snatch them away for dissections. There was a group of what could only be described as delinquents surrounding Rael, who seemed concerned for Rael's well-being, and they interacted with each other in a familiar way to Rael. Banter, teasing, jokes. The way Rael interacted with Frank and Chris, or Carol. Another woman spoke to Rael, one covered in burn scars and wearing an eye patch. At this sight, an intrusive thought came into Rael's self-destructive mindscape. What if this woman was like me? A thought Rael quickly disregarded. However, After conversing with this woman longer, she referred to the bombs as little wonders, and radiantly recalled anecdotes of her own experiences with explosives.
I just hope somebody who's still whole can pull you back from the edge. You see, if that happens, I'm sure you'll be able to live as a human. Rail.
Upon meeting this eccentric group and the fellow bomb enthusiast, those words from Christopher echoed in Rail's head. But to Rail, these people were still too whole, and nobody who wasn't broken couldn't reach Rail. Nobody but Chris. That same night, Rail and the two women, who they came to know as Miria, the innocent one, and Nice, the bomb fanatic, were kidnapped by ominous men in black. They interrogated Rail and Nice about the bombs, which apparently belonged to someone they were associated with. Rail was unfortunate enough to encounter these adults, who were some of the most terrifying beings Rail had ever encountered, like the researchers who lacerated his flesh, like their boss, Huey, like that time Rail fought a man who utilized a giant wrench as his weapon, and like that woman with the unsettlingly guileless face. They hadn't even done anything to Rail, Nice, or Miria. The mere presence of these men in black was enough to convince Rail that they were bad news. The hopelessness which Rail felt in this moment was enough to prepare them for death. Seeing Frank or Chris again, killing Huey or the other people he feared, making friends with Miria or Nice, it was all off the table. Now, the only option left was to die, and maybe take these men with them. Rail saw an opportunity to retrieve their bombs and to take out everyone in the room, but just then, a frightfully familiar figure entered the room, the woman who attempted to kidnap and dissect Rail, Renee Parmedes Ranvillier. This woman is just like Huey. Blow her away, if anyone, her most of all. Rail had missed his shot and threw the bomb too far, but Rail and Nice used the smoke as their chance to escape. They eventually ended up on the roof of this skyscraper and were cornered by Renee and her researchers. At this point, Rail was becoming something they hated, something who was even forgetting about their love for Frank and Chris, someone who descended too deeply into the pit of self-destruction, a point of no return. A crazy ruckus had begun on this roof. First, a boy with a tattoo of a sword on his face appeared and desperately called out for Nice, one who Nice referred to as Jacuzzi. Next, Miria appeared, who somehow escaped from the men in black. And then, an enemy appeared, a man who terrified Rail, the man who started their fear of ordinary humans. Graham Spectre, wielding a giant wrench and speaking in a manner that was all over the place, and didn't make a lick of sense. Blow it up. In this horrible situation, with nowhere to run, those words rang louder than ever. Blow it up. The wrench fighter and his flunkies locked themselves in combat with the gun-wielding researchers, and that boy Jacuzzi was trying to weave through them to get to Nice. These events were becoming blurry to Rail. As these words continued to overtake Rail's state of mind, they reached into the bomb bag, prepared to blow everyone up, until a voice screamed across the rooftop, one belonging to the girl from Chicago, the one who introduced herself as Carol. Rail only met Carol a few days prior, but in this moment, their interactions with her came to them like nostalgic core memories. Rail certainly couldn't blow her up. So, bomb in hand, Rail made one choice that would decide their fate. They pulled the pin, made for the edge of the skyscraper, and plunged themselves deeper into the pit of self-destruction, intending to hit the bottom and to disappear forever. Falling backwards, letting the bomb fall from their grip, Rail had a clear view of the open sky, for what felt like the first time ever. Christopher had a deep respect for nature, and Rail thought, in this moment, they finally understood why. To be reminded of the good in humanity, and to appreciate nature at the end like this wasn't a bad way to go. Rail was going to die with a smile on their scarred face. And apparently, with the screams of a boy ringing in their ears.
You can't do that! It's dangerous!
For a moment, Rail thought that Christopher, their big brother Christopher, had grabbed their hand. But instead, Jacuzzi had decided to share his fate with Rail by grabbing their hand, attempting to hold on to the roof's perimeter fence, and losing his grip once the bomb below exploded and shocked the two with a gust. Jacuzzi was falling with Rail, until another hand grabbed the boys. It was Nice, leaning over the fence, struggling to hold the weight of two people with her small frame. Another shape appeared over the fence, shouting and reaching for Rail. It was Miria. She had grabbed the edge of the roof to get close enough to reach Rail. For once, Rail didn't second guess whether or not this woman had bad intentions, and so, Rail stuck out their hand to meet hers. Rail and Jacuzzi were finally ascending. A second gust from the explosion blew up from underneath, causing Nice and Miria to lose their grip. Just as Miria's fingers slipped, Miria called out the name of the man who grabbed her slipping fingers. At that, it was finally enough people to pull Rail up and out from the pit of self-destruction.
I just hope somebody who's still whole can pull you back from the edge. You see, if that happens, I'm sure you'll be able to live as a human. Rail.
Rail was invited to join Nice and Jacuzzi's group of eccentric delinquents and found a kindred spirit in Nice, a fellow mad bomber. It started with the girl in Chicago, Carol, then the bomb enthusiast in the warehouse, and finally, on a certain rooftop where Rail was saved from the brink of suicide by various shining people. Rail finally learned to let new things into their life, no longer desperately waiting for those who were gone to save them, to adapt to new possibilities to make them feel whole again, to fix the broken homunculus. And perhaps this is a lesson that a certain dino has recently learned too. Well, never mind.